The gospel reading for today comprises two gospel passages that have been combined. Usually these passages might be ignored because they consist merely of introductory or concluding comments that form bridges between the main stories in the Gospels. They're just transitional paragraphs, really, and they say more or less the same thing, that Jesus was becoming so popular that he ended up preaching, teaching, and healing great crowds of people wherever he went. As incidental, however, as these paragraphs appear, they may speak about something more than the historical circumstances of Jesus's ministry. They can provide for us a kind of snapshot of Jesus and his disciples and the wider world that continues to have currency for us today. For we also are disciples. We also have a task to do in the world. They speak about the church, perhaps, as a community of disciples that gathers around Jesus and that follows Jesus into his world. The first section begins with the return of the 12 disciples, or apostles, who had just completed the mission that Jesus had sent them on. You may recall that he sent them with no bag, no bread, no money, to preach and teach and to heal in the villages. Now they've done all their preaching and healing, and they return to tell Jesus all about it. Jesus seems to notice how tired they are, for he says to the apostles, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." So they take a boat trip to a deserted place. The only problem is that other people see where Jesus and his disciples are heading, and they run ahead on the shore and get there before them. The place was no longer deserted, so Jesus had to abandon plan A and get on with preaching and healing those who had come to him. Allow me then this morning to organize a few thoughts about Jesus and his disciples around the themes of gathering, resting, and serving. And I hope we'll see that we too as disciples might learn something about gathering, resting, and serving. First then, the church is the community of the disciples of Jesus. It is the community of those who gather around the person of Jesus. And I think you might have heard that in the reading. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. They seem enthusiastic about their exploits. We don't know whether Jesus shared their enthusiasm. We do know that he noticed their tiredness. Indeed, Mark provides what I think is a wonderful picture of the church as a community of imperfect, exhausted disciples gathering around Jesus for some conversation. So I wonder whether we recognize ourselves in this picture. Are we the people who gather around Jesus, whether in personal prayer or Bible study, or by joining with others in the worship of the church? Or, I wonder, has the television or some other form of entertainment rather taken the place of Jesus in our lives? What or who we gather round makes all the difference to who we really are. The apostles gathered around Jesus. I wonder, do we? Now, the second aspect is that of resting. Jesus says, "Come away all by yourselves and rest a while." It reminds me of that Old Testament passage. Those 10 commandments. You remember those, don't you? 6 days shall you labor, but on the 7th you shall rest. Well, the apostles may or may not have been out for 6 days, but we see the same kind of rhythm a rhythm at work between working and resting. And let's be honest, our workaholic world doesn't seem to like this message. We seem to think that we should work, 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 or at the very least, go, go, go. But the Bible and the Christian gospel say otherwise. Why is it, I wonder, that Christians often treat Sabbath as an optional extra? Worse, some of us try to make others feel guilty if they follow the command and rest for a while. Of course, it's true that in Mark chapter 3, the plan to rest does not quite work out. There is some rest, but only while the disciples are on the boat. Yet the intention and the pattern Jesus lays down are sure enough. It's no bad thing to come away to a deserted place and rest a while. Indeed, it is necessary, not always to our surviving, but certainly to our thriving. The lack of rest impacts negatively on mental health and quite possibly on longevity. The words of Jesus remind us of our need to rest. They also contradict the myth of universal availability that's so current in Christian circles. No human being can be always available to everyone. All of us must prioritize, and all of us must be prepared to say, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that right now. What is it that Elton Trueblood said? Too many commitments amount virtually to none. We cannot do everything, and we should not try. Come away to a deserted place and rest a while, said Jesus. Who are we to disagree with him? Finally, let me say a few words about serving. For in Jesus, and as the context and the content, I should say, of the chapter unfolds in the disciples, we see examples of renewed service rendered toward God and humanity. Jesus and his disciples are out for a rest when suddenly they're confronted with a crowd of people in great need. Jesus meets that need with what I think is rather amazing serenity under the circumstances. He had compassion for people because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Now, you might sense in this part of the story a kind of underside to the suggestion that I've just made, that we cannot always be available. Jesus was amazingly available, even when interrupted by the presence of crowds. But perhaps his serenity came from knowing when he should say yes and when he should say no. And perhaps we too could develop a similar kind of serenity. How we need the Holy Spirit to help us. For while we surely must seek to avoid the tyranny of interruptions, we must know surely that sometimes God is in the interruptions to our plans. In her wonderful book, The Silent Cry, Dorothy Zeller tells how the mystic Heinrich Susa was immersed in deep contemplation when a woman came to the cloister gate, wanting to speak with him. But he had her sent away, not wanting to be disturbed in his contemplation. Of course, that was shattered. And with the woman who had left sadly, God had also left. Upon realizing this, he ran after her for hours through the barren countryside. As the poet Jason Schinder used to say, whatever gets in the way of the work is the work. Sometimes God is in the interruptions. Well, as I close, I just want to say a few words about Mark's use of the term apostle. You'll know perhaps that the word apostle means sent one. Now, Mark uses the word apostle sparingly for the 12, those first disciples of Jesus. They were apostles, sent ones. But Mark's use of the word brings us immediately to this balance that we're thinking about and trying to achieve between coming and going, gathering and sending. Mark uses the word apostle only twice in his gospel. On both occasions, I think as much is said about gathering as about sending. See if you agree. In Mark chapter 3 and verse 14, Mark says, "And he," meaning Jesus, "appointed 12, whom he also named apostles." He appointed 12, whom he named apostles, to be with him and to be sent out to proclaim the message. In Mark 6, we read, the apostles, sent ones, gathered around Jesus, and he said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." It doesn't sound very apostolic, does it? Not so much about sending as about first coming, gathering, being with Jesus. It appears that only those who spend time in the company of Jesus can represent him faithfully in the world. The church, as I suggested before, is the company of broken people who gather around the person of Jesus, seeking forgiveness, help, and empowerment. I think all of us would have more to say, more to give, if we would gather around Jesus more than we currently do. I think we might be better disciples if we rested a little more often too. Yet in our gathering and in our resting, we might stop to consider what it's all about. For after the disciples had gathered and rested, after they had recuperated, they learned how to feed the crowds with the bread of life. How wonderful then that we too can be equipped by Christ to serve him in the world. We can rest at the feet of Jesus right now as we gather at his table to break bread with him. Let's do that, shall we? Let's gather and rest a while before Christ sends us into his world. Amen.